James Holloway had never planned to return to Willow Creek. It was the kind of town that never let you forget who you were, no matter how far you ran. Growing up, he had always been the only black kid in his school. His mother had worked as a housekeeper for the wealthier families, scrubbing floors in homes she was never allowed to own. His father had left when he was too young to remember, swallowed whole by the system. Another statistic in a place where justice wasn't meant for men who looked like him. James had escaped. Or so he thought. He had built a life in Chicago, working as a journalist, writing stories that mattered, exposing the cracks in a country that prided itself on pretending those cracks didn't exist. But then his mother died, and Willow Creek called him home. He arrived just before sunset, the town unchanged. The same gas station where old men sat outside on wooden benches watching him with wary eyes. The same grocery store with its peeling paint and a "closed" sign in the window, even though he could see people shopping inside. And the same police station where he had been dragged as a teenager for walking home too late. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He hadn't even been in town for 5 minutes, and already the past was pressing down on his chest. He drove straight to his mother's house, an old creaky thing on the edge of town, tucked behind the willow trees that gave the place its name. It smelled the same, like old books and lemon-scented cleaner. His mother's presence was everywhere, and so was the memory of what had happened here. James had been 15 when they burned the cross. He remembered the glow of the flames outside his bedroom window, the way his mother had pulled him down to the floor, her hands clamped over his mouth to keep him from making a sound. And he remembered the voices outside, laughter, and a name. Holloway, you don't belong here. Now, standing in the same house where it had happened, James felt it all over again. The fear, the helplessness, the rage. He had buried it for years. Told himself that if he left, it wouldn't matter anymore. But standing here, surrounded by his mother's belongings, he realized the truth. It had never left him. The first time James saw the sign, he thought it was a joke. A "for sale" notice, right in front of his mother's house. Except he hadn't put it there. His fists clenched. Someone had been on his property. He yanked the sign out of the ground and stormed back inside. He barely had time to process his anger before a knock at the door. James turned. His jaw tightened. Through the peephole, he saw Sheriff Bill Maddox, the same man who had pulled him over as a teenager for looking suspicious, the same man who had let the boys who burned the cross go home without so much as a slap on the wrist. James opened the door just enough to show his face. "Evening," Maddox said, his voice as oily as ever. "Didn't know you'd be coming back, Holloway." James stared at him. The sheriff rocked back on his heels. "Saw you took the sign down. Shame. Would have gotten a good price for this place." James's fingers curled into fists. "I'm not selling." Maddox's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well now, that's unfortunate." James didn't blink. He could feel it, the warning in Maddox's voice, the promise behind his words. He had grown up in this town. He knew how this worked. It started with the sign. Then came the late-night phone calls. No one ever spoke, just silence. Then came the footsteps outside his house. Then came the bricks through the window. James reported it, but nothing happened. Maddox just smirked when James confronted him. "If you're feeling unsafe," he said, "maybe it's best if you just move on." James knew what that meant. They wanted him gone. But this time, he wasn't leaving. James didn't go to the police. He went to the historical records. The town library still kept the old newspapers, the ones no one read anymore. And that's where he found it. 1956. Black family driven out of Willow Creek. 1968 clicks. Unknown fire destroys black-owned business. 1982. Black teenager disappears. Case unsolved. James's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. This was history repeating itself. They had been doing this for generations, and now it was his turn. He wrote the article that night. Every name, every story, every crime they had buried. And the next morning, he published it for the whole world to see. They came for him that night. He knew they would, but this time, he was ready. James sat on his porch, the baseball bat resting against his leg. The headlights appeared first. Then the truck. It rolled to a stop in front of his house, just like it had 20 years ago. The men inside didn't bother with masks. Wanted him to see them, to be afraid. James didn't move, didn't blink, because this time he wasn't 15. This time he had power, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, voices rose in the dark. His neighbors, his friends, the people he had thought would stay silent. But they had read his article. They had seen the truth. And now, they stood with him. The men in the truck hesitated. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to be the ones in control. But tonight, they weren't. The truck backed away. The tires screeched. And just like that, they were gone. James didn't sleep that night. He stayed on the porch watching the road, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't, because now they knew the whole world was watching, and there was no going back. The next morning, Maddox resigned. Within the week, a federal investigation began. And just like that, Willow Creek changed. Not overnight, not easily, but the fear was gone, because James Holloway had given them something stronger. A voice. And this time, they weren't afraid to use it. James Holloway never thought staying in Willow Creek would be easy. Change was slow, and the town had long memories. The faces that once glared at him from behind gas station counters now wore forced smiles, but he could still feel the unease beneath them. They knew what he had done. He had exposed them, had shattered the illusion that Willow Creek was just another quiet southern town. Now some wanted him gone more than ever, and some wanted him dead. The first threat came a week after Maddox's resignation. A note slipped under his front door. "You should have left." No name, no signature. James read it twice, then burnt it. If they thought they could scare him, they were wrong. But then the phone calls started again. No voices, just breathing. Then came the shadow in his yard. A figure standing just beyond the porch light, watching. Every time he went outside, it was gone. End quote. He started carrying his father's old revolver, keeping it in his nightstand, loaded, because this time, he wasn't going anywhere. The morning after the third note, James decided he had had enough. He went to the police station, half expecting them to shrug him off. Instead, he found someone new sitting behind the sheriff's desk. Officer Elena Martinez. She was young, sharp-armed, and not from around here. "I read your article," she said. "A lot of folks did." James narrowed his eyes. "And," she leaned forward, "and I don't think you're safe here." James scoffed. "You think I don't know that? I think you should take it seriously," Martinez said. "Maddox is gone, but the people who backed him aren't, and now they're scared." James folded his arms. "Good. Let them be scared." Martinez exhaled, rubbing her temples. "You don't get it. Men like them, they don't like losing. They don't like when someone like you gets the last word." James met her gaze, unwavering. "I don't care," Martinez sighed. "Then let me help." James hesitated. For the first time in his life, a cop was offering to stand with him. He wasn't sure if he trusted her, but he had to start somewhere. That night, his house was set on fire. The flames ripped through the walls, devouring the memories his mother had left behind. James barely made it out. By the time the fire department arrived, the house was nothing but embers. A lifetime turned to ash. Martinez showed up minutes later, fury burning in her eyes. "This wasn't random," she said. James nodded. "I know." They both knew, but they also knew the truth wouldn't matter to the town. There would be no arrests, no justice. Just the same quiet hate that had always lurked beneath the surface. Martinez looked at him. "So what now?" James clenched his jaw. They wanted him out. They wanted him to run. He wouldn't. This town belongs to me as much as it belongs to them. His voice was steady. "I'm not leaving." Martinez studied him, then nodded. "Then let's make them pay for what they did." James had lost his home, but he still had his words. And now, he had an ally. Together, he and Martinez began investigating. Not just the fire, not just the threats, everything. They dug through old case files, uncovered missing persons reports that never made the news. They found documents that tied town officials to the Klan in the 80s, and the same names still sitting on city council today. James wrote the story. Martinez made sure it spread, and this time the world paid attention. Protests erupted in Willow Creek. News vans parked outside the police station. The Department of Justice opened an investigation. The same men who had threatened James, who had burned his house, were now running, covering their tracks. And then, the first arrest, a town official, then a former police chief, then more. One by one, the town's secrets were unearthed. The new sheriff, Martinez, made sure none of them walked away clean. Even the mayor, the one who had sat silent while black families were pushed to the edges of town, resigned in disgrace. James watched it happen from the same place he had once felt powerless, standing outside his mother's burned-down home. And for the first time in his life, Willow Creek was changing, because this time, James Holloway wasn't the one running. He was the one fighting back, and he wasn't done yet. Nathan Carter had lived in Pinecrest his entire life. It was a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches stretching wide, casting dappled shadows over the cracked sidewalks. On the surface, Pinecrest was picturesque, the kind of town that seemed frozen in time. But beneath the charm, there were fractures, cracks that had always been there, hidden just out of sight. Nathan had felt those cracks growing up. His father had warned him about them, had told him in hushed tones about the things no one spoke about in public. The glances, the unwritten rules, the way some doors stayed closed, no matter how hard you knocked. Nathan had never wanted to believe it. He had always told himself that times had changed, that things were different now. But deep down, he had known the truth. Pinecrest had never really changed. It had just learned to wear a better mask. It was late one summer evening when he first saw the sign. He had been walking home from work, cutting through the back streets like he always did. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and asphalt, the humidity wrapping around him like a second skin. He had almost missed it, but something made him stop. There, nailed to an old wooden post at the edge of town, was a sign he had never seen before. Whites only after sundown. Nathan's breath caught in his throat, his hands clenched into fists. The sign was old, its paint faded and chipped, but the words were unmistakable, a remnant of a past that should have been long buried, a ghost of a law that had no place in the present. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at it. Then, slowly he reached out and tore it down. The next morning, another sign was there, and this time, it had his name on it. Nathan Carter, leave while you can. The town was watching. He could feel it, the way people looked at him when he passed, the sudden hush when he walked into a room. He knew what this was. A warning. A message. The past wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. That night, the knock came. Slow, deliberate. Boom, boom, boom. Nathan sat up in bed, his heart hammering. The clock on his nightstand read 3:12 a.m. He waited, holding his breath. Maybe he had imagined it. Boom, boom, boom. The sound came again, heavier this time, rattling the old wooden frame of his front door. Nathan climbed out of bed, his body tense. He moved carefully through the dark, his bare feet silent against the floorboards. He reached the door and pressed his ear against it. Silence, he exhaled, shaking his head. Just the wind, he told himself. Just boom, boom, boom. His stomach turned to ice. He took a deep breath and unlocked the door. No one was there, but something was. A single piece of paper nailed to the wood. Get out. Nathan stepped back, his pulse roaring in his ears. He grabbed the paper, crumpling it in his fist. His gaze darted across the street, scanning the shadows. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze, their branches whispering against each other. Then he saw them. Silhouettes just beyond the tree line. Watching. He slammed the door shut. Pinecrest had never changed. The next morning, he went to the sheriff. Sheriff Whitaker was an old man, his skin weathered by years under the southern sun. He had known Nathan's family for as long as Nathan could remember. They had shared Sunday barbecues, shaken hands at town hall meetings. If anyone would help, it would be him. Nathan laid the crumpled note on the sheriff's desk. I want to know who's doing this. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, adjusting his hat. He picked up the note, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed. Nathan, he said slowly, you know how things are around here. Nathan's jaw clenched. Yeah, he said. I do, and I'm not going anywhere. Whitaker's eyes met his. Something flickered there. Something almost like regret. You should, he said. Nathan's stomach turned. He grabbed the note and stood. So that's it? He asked. That's all you have to say? Whitaker didn't answer. Nathan left, without another word. That night, the knocking came again. Boom, boom, boom. Nathan didn't move. Boom, boom. This time, it wasn't just at his door. It was at his windows. At his back door. All around him. Nathan clenched his fists, his breath coming fast. He grabbed the baseball bat beside his bed and moved toward the front door. He swung it open. The street was empty, but something was waiting for him. Another sign. Past midnight. Your time is up. Nathan's grip tightened on the bat. His heart pounded. He turned his head slowly, scanning the darkness. That's when he saw them. Figures standing at the end of the street. Watching. Waiting. Nathan took a step forward, and they moved. A dozen shadows, stepping out from the dark, their faces hidden beneath old hoods. Their movements slow, deliberate. Nathan's breath came in sharp gasps. He stepped back into his house, locking the door behind him. Boom, boom, boom. The knocking was at his door again. Then a voice. Low. Hollow. Ron? Nathan's blood turned cold. Not a threat. A warning. Boom, boom, boom. Then silence. Nathan stayed awake until the sun rose, his hands clenched around the bat. When dawn broke, he stepped outside. The street was empty, but something had changed. The town was different. The air felt heavier. The past was awake, and it wasn't going back to sleep. Nathan Carter wasn't the type to scare easily. He had spent his whole life in Pinecrest, learning how to navigate its quiet hostility, its whispered rules. But the night of the knocking had changed something. It had cracked the illusion, peeling back the layers of civility to reveal something raw, something old. He hadn't slept since that night. He hadn't left either. Maybe he should have. Maybe that would have been the smart thing to do. But Nathan had never been the type to run, so he stayed. The next morning, the town felt different. Not on the surface. The buildings still stood. The trees still swayed in the breeze. People still went about their day like nothing had happened. But Nathan saw it in their eyes. The way they looked at him, then quickly looked away. The way conversations stopped when he walked by. He had always felt like an outsider in his own hometown, but this was different. This was fear. Not his fear, theirs. And that scared him more than anything. That afternoon, Nathan walked into the diner on Main Street, the little hole in the wall that had been serving the same burgers and fries since the 60s. A few heads turned as he stepped inside. People weren't staring, exactly. They were watching. Maggie, the owner, was behind the counter. She had known Nathan since he was a kid. She gave him a tight-lipped smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Coffee?" she asked, like nothing was wrong. Nathan sat at the counter. Yeah. She poured him a cup, the coffee black and steaming. Nathan wrapped his hands around it, more for something to do than anything else. "Everything okay, Maggie?" he asked, watching her carefully. Maggie stiffened. Gosh, why wouldn't it be? Nathan tapped his fingers against the mug. "'Cause someone left a sign on my door last night, and then a bunch of people showed up outside my house." Maggie's hand tightened around the coffee pot. Nathan leaned forward. "You know something, don't you?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "Nathan, I think you should let this go." "Let what go?" She hesitated, then leaned in close. Her voice was barely a whisper. "This place has rules, Nathan." His stomach turned. "Yeah, I know. I just never figured out who was making them." Maggie pulled back, her face unreadable. "Some things are older than this town," she said. "Older than any of us." Nathan frowned. "What does that mean?" Before she could answer, the bell above the diner door jingled. Sheriff Whitaker walked in. He saw Nathan immediately, his expression darkening. Whitaker walked over to the counter, took the seat next to Nathan, and ordered a coffee like it was just another day. But Nathan could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the counter. "You still here?" Whitaker asked. Nathan sipped his coffee. "Looks that way." The sheriff sighed, stirring his drink with a slow, deliberate motion. "Nathan," he said finally, "you need to leave." Nathan stared at him. "Why?" Whitaker didn't answer right away. He took a long sip, then set his cup down. "Because you poked something you shouldn't have." Nathan tensed. "I didn't poke anything. I just tore down a damn sign." Whitaker shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You woke something up." A cold knot settled in Nathan's stomach. "What happens if I don't leave?" he asked. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "You don't want to find out." Nathan held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment, then set his cup down and stood. He wasn't going to get any answers here. As he turned to leave, Whitaker grabbed his arm. "You see another sign," the sheriff said, his voice low. "Don't touch it." Nathan pulled his arm free and walked out of the diner. But later that night, when he found the sign nailed to his front door, he tore it down anyway. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a name. His name. And beneath it, midnight. Nathan stood on his porch, the paper clenched in his hand. The town was silent, the streets empty. But he knew they were out there, watching, waiting. Boom, boom, boom. The knocking came at exactly midnight. Nathan didn't move. Boom, boom, boom. It was at his front door, his back door, his windows, then his bedroom. Nathan's breath caught. He spun, staring down the darkened hallway toward his room. Boom, boom, boom. The sound was inside the house. Nathan grabbed the baseball bat from beside his couch and moved carefully down the hall. The air was thick, charged with something unseen. Every hair on his body stood on end. Boom, boom, boom. He reached the door. Slowly, he pushed it open. The room was empty, but the window was open, and on the bed, another sign, "Get out." Nathan swallowed hard, His fingers tightened around the bat. Then, a whisper, "Not outside." Not in his head. Behind him, Nathan spun, swinging the bat. Nothing. Only shadows. Only silence. But the air was colder now. The house felt different, like something had shifted. Then, from the darkness, footsteps. Slow, measured, coming up the stairs. Nathan's grip on the bat tightened. He stepped toward the hallway, his breath shallow. The footsteps stopped. Then, boom, boom, boom. Not at the door, at his bedroom closet. Nathan's chest tightened. He forced himself forward, his heart hammering. The closet door creaked open. A figure stood inside. Tall, thin, dressed in shadows. Its face was hidden, but it was smiling. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back. The figure stepped forward. "I told you," it whispered. "You should have left." The lights flickered. The air grew thick, and the last thing Nathan saw was its eyes. Then, darkness.